Welcome back to Disputes and Perspectives. My name is Justin Angotti, and I'm an international trade and national security attorney here in Washington, D.C., and joined today by my colleague Philip, who's a partner in our Brussels office, to talk a little bit about the EU's response to the Supreme Court's recent decision in validating President Trump's tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. So I guess to kick us off, Philip, tell us a little bit about what the immediate reaction has been in Europe.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me, Justin. It's great to be discussing this topic with you, of course, from a more European side of things. I think the immediate reaction from Europe, and that is the political level, I guess, was a typical European reaction in the sense that we first saw a few of the leaders of different countries respond. Chancellor Merz, President Macron had their own views on things, which generally reflected a sentiment of rule of law and certain happiness with the fact that these tariffs, which they have deemed to be unlawful, are now struck down by the Supreme Court. But at the same time, I think there was also a realization that there would be something in lieu of what existed. So that was the immediate reaction. We then saw the European Commission come in, especially once the US administration started talking about Section 122 tariffs and a replacement for what was struck down with a firm statement, at least according to European Commission standards, saying that a deal is a deal and they didn't want to see or don't want to see any increased tariffs on EU origin goods. And so that was, as said, a balanced response, a usual response, first the member states, then the Commission, stating that they definitely don't want to see a step back from what was already there before the ruling, but at the same time also welcoming the ruling from a rule of law perspective.
Well, and Philip, on that point, on the Turnberry deal, right? I mean, the U.S. heralded this agreement with the EU last summer that effectively gave EU origin goods a somewhat favorable treatment under the reciprocal tariff regime. You sort of capped out at an all-in tariff rate, general duty plus the reciprocal tariff at 15%. And that came with a number of commitments from the EU. The US side of that deal doesn't have anything to give right now. And so where does that leave us from an EU perspective?
Yeah, very good question. And I think that's also the most asked question by our clients. It leaves us in a position where we have a trade deal which is currently negotiated but not formally ratified. And we see that the immediate political reaction has been to put that deal on ice, at least from a European Parliament perspective. At the same time, again, I said before, the European Commission did want to make sure that the EU is not worse off under a replacement for the IEEPA tariffs. So on the one hand, a deal is a deal, and they want to make sure that we're not getting above the 15% that was committed to by the US administration. But on the other hand, you're totally right. In a sense, the legal basis or the balance that was there is no longer there. And in a sense, that deal is now somewhere in the twilight zone, and it's unclear whether it's going to uphold longer term.
And I guess as a practical matter, in some ways, depending on what you import from the EU, you might be better off now than you were before the Supreme Court's ruling, right? The general duty rate on lots of things coming into the US is free. The sort of weighted duty rate, if you think about volume of imports pre-Trump 2.0 tariffs, was sitting at like 2%. So in some ways, some European exporters may be in a better spot because 12 is lower than 15.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I think it's heavily dependent on the business and the specific goods that are being imported in the US. And so I think the ultimate goal for the European Union is to create certainty. And so in that sense, this ruling isn't welcomed that much because we're away from a balance, and we're now in again at a point where there's a lot of unclarity. And so also, if you look at the reaction that's come from business more broadly and industry federations, there's been different ways to look at the situation, right? And so I think that the broader narrative has been, let's make sure that businesses are acting consistently when exporting goods to the US and importing them in the US. So if they choose to push for that lower tariff under the Section 122 tariffs, do that consistently and don't cherry pick and say, like, one time we're applying a 10 plus MFN tariff, which lands us at 10%, and the other time we're applying a max 15% tariff under the deal. So consistency is key, but at the same time, there's currently no clarity on what's the appropriate way to do things.
Right, a sort of the Supreme Court's ruling is potentially a legal win that has just created some of the same uncertainty and chaos that we had last April. How does this work? When will it change? And ultimately, what does that mean for companies trying to manage a business? So, I guess on that particular point, what is European industry thinking about, at least in the short term, and how you navigate this uncertainty?
I think there's a few points, right? I mean, obviously there's direct lane between the EU or broader Europe and the US, so to speak. And there's been a lot of voices in Brussels on how to react to the ruling and making sure that the EU is not acting too quickly in that whole discussion from a political standpoint, but at the same time focusing on providing clarity to businesses. Businesses don't have that clarity today, so they need to manage the uncertainty as they did before. And I think most of the businesses that have been preparing for, say, the last year for tariff changes are applying the same methods now, right? Assessing what volumes are going to the US, how are they impacted by the Supreme Court ruling? Is there a need to change supplies? Is there a need to change warehousing in the US? Pricing structures? Is there an impact on contracts? I mean, they're not going through that entire review again, right? But it's on a continuous basis that they try to understand the impact on their operations and processes. At the same time, and I think that's a less discussed or less debated part of this balance, there's the lanes coming into the EU, not from the US, right? But from the entire world. And what you often see after changes in the tariff space is that businesses acting globally start diverting trade to other jurisdictions where it's more favorable to trade, right? And so I think that's part of the picture where EU companies are now looking whether the Supreme Court ruling, which impacts tariffs in the US, will also have an impact on inbound flows in the EU and whether that's affecting EU industry. At the same time, if we also look at the political level, we see that the EU is not just looking at the US relationship, but trying to manage a better business environment from a tariff perspective with other countries, right? We had trade deal with India. We had a trade deal with Mercosur. We're probably headed towards a trade deal with Australia. And those open up new markets for businesses in the EU and allow businesses to diversify in terms of their marketing. And so you see that it's becoming very quickly a more economic business management topic, where initially we're looking at, okay, what's the impact of the ruling, legally speaking? Do we need to apply for refunds? What is the relationship with our customers in the US? And that quickly pivots to, okay, do we need to expand our horizon in terms of markets where we're looking at? And the EU is actively weighing on that debate from what they can do in terms of trade deals and working with third countries to improve the business position. I think a last element I want to add to that, because again, this is a very diverse picture or very fragmented picture, so you like, is that the EU has an arsenal of responses ready for the US, right? And they haven't, well, as always, the EU is quite slow to respond, has a quite heavy process to get to a legal response to whatever is happening outside of the EU. And so at the start of 2025, once we saw the first tariff activity coming from the US, the EU has worked on a response to those tariffs, right? In the form of retaliation tariff measures that are currently, again, put on ice, but they can pretty easily be defrosted. And there has been discussion on other measures in terms of addressing tech firms from the US with digital taxes and trying to retaliate of sorts. I believe it's not very likely that there's going to be lots of activities on that front soon, even though you never know in the current environment. But what you do see is that the EU is stepping up their game in terms of forming or completing the single market, trying to be better at acting as one, strengthening enforcement at the external border. And you see that the initial activity, which was tariff focused and which was a numbers game, is now very much becoming a mind shift at the EU level, right? And where you see that enforcement is picking up. There's an EU customs reform that's coming up, which will lead to more enforcement, better enforcement at the border, not just of tariffs, but also, and actually most importantly, product compliance legislation, EU standards that businesses need to abide by.
Well, and on that point, Philip, it's right. The EU, although maybe slower than President Trump under the reciprocal tariff regime, certainly moved comparatively quickly to put countermeasures in place. We've got sort of a tariff rate quota regime that's been proposed on the steel side to replace safeguards that are going to expire in the middle of this year. And so maybe unlike or maybe only akin to China and the UK, their EU has been one of the trading partners who was able, like Canada as well, able to sort of put something in place that pushed back on the administration. And I guess a lesson learned from the lead up to the Supreme Court's decision here, which is that when the EU feels like it needs to act, either to pressure a better deal or to protect its interests or a little of both, it can. And that was seemingly effective in reaching the Turnberry deal, right? It wasn't just a one-sided, the U.S. Power to tariff, but there were countermeasures that seemingly softened the administration's position. So something on the U.S. side to keep in mind is that the uncertainty on our side, I think, is matched a little bit on the EU side with what the government is able to do.
Yeah, and I mean, there's obviously also an interest for the EU to act in a legally certain, stable manner, right? And that's a very vocal point that you hear here in Brussels, right? So the EU wants to position itself as a market where you can do business, and at least beforehand how your business is going to be affected by certain measures. At the same time, the EU doesn't always live up to that standard, because we've had a discussion on CBAM, on EU deforestation regulations, where the EU was pretty late in adopting, implementing acts, or even pushing out the regulations. So there's still some work to be done. But I think the EU has done a pretty good job in giving businesses the legal certainty they need in order to operate in a consistent manner. And I think that's also what the EU is intending to do, to position itself next to the current volatility that we're seeing, either pushed by the US administration because they're targeting certain sectors, or as a consequence of course, the legal developments like a Supreme Court ruling.
And I guess as we sort of a last question maybe for you is, as we think about bringing us back to sort of a level of stability between the two trading partners, is there a cause for optimism that we can stabilize the relationship? And, and a little bit of crystal ball here, in light of what has happened in the past couple of days, and sort of the world focus now in the Middle East, not only is there an opportunity for optimism, but do we think that comes quickly, or do we think that it takes a back burner to events in the Middle East right now and maybe becomes a secondary priority for the EU and the US?
Yeah, hard to say. You're asking difficult questions,
Crystal
Justin.
ball. I want a crystal ball.
No, I mean, it would be unfair to say that uncertainty is a standard these days. But it's hard to predict, of course, and I don't want to predict necessarily. But if we look at what's happened in hindsight, I mean, we've lived in relative stability over the past year or so, right? Maybe a bit less, right? Let's say over the past 7-8 months, right? The Supreme Court ruling comes as an unfortunate event for the US administration, and brings a bit of unclarity and uncertainty for businesses globally. But it's clear that the EU has an intention to create stability. I believe the US administration, by quoting or stating that they want to uphold the deals that were struck, has a similar view. And you can debate whether that's a fair position, right? But we
want you to give us everything you promised in the deal.
It's at least creating an outlook that allows us to think that in a couple of weeks from now, we'll know the baseline situation. And we have reasons to believe, I have reasons to believe, that baseline situation will last, hopefully, for more than a couple of months this time. At the same time, you know better than I do that Section 232 investigations are ongoing. So we're expecting more tariff activity, and who knows what happens in response to that new activity. But I believe that's going to be more sector specific, sector focused. And so the response would likely be sector specific as well, or at least proportionate to how the industry is affected. So we can't predict certainty, and it would be almost foolish to think that it's going to be certain as of tomorrow. But I do think there's a good outlook that at least the baseline tariff situation will be clear in a few weeks from now, and businesses can hopefully go on as usual.
Predictably unpredictable, but with cause for optimism. So thanks, Philip. Appreciate you being with us. And for everyone joining us today, be sure to check back for more episodes on this topic as we continue to monitor and advise on what businesses can be doing.
Disputes in Perspective is a Reed Smith production. Our producer is Shannon Ryan. For more information about Reed Smith's litigation and dispute resolution practice, please email disputesinperspective@reedsmith.com. You can find our podcast on podcast streaming platforms, reedsmith.com, and our social media accounts at reedsmithllp. This podcast is provided for educational purposes. It does not constitute legal advice and is not intended to establish an attorney-client relationship, nor is it intended to suggest or establish standards of care applicable to particular lawyers in any given situation. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Any views, opinions, or comments made by any external guest speaker are not to be attributed to Reed Smith LLP or its individual lawyers. All rights reserved.